Hi, this is Drury's Bluff, just south of Richmond in Virginia. It is the site of two interesting incidents. The first, 160 years ago, was during the Civil War, when it was the location of a fairly significant battle during the Peninsular Campaign. The USS Monitor and other ironclad ships from the Union Army tried to come up the James River with the intention of attacking Richmond. They were repulsed here at Drury's Bluff, and that wound up extending the Civil War by another 3 years. The other incident may be less known. It was 30 years ago, almost 130 years to the day after the Civil War battle, when Beverly Monroe met a state police investigator by the name of Dave Riley here, and she signed a kind of semi-confession that wound up getting her convicted for murder, and which was an interesting lesson in a variety of things relating to forensic science that I'd like to talk to you about. So it all started with a man by the name of Roger de la Bird, who was the man who died either by suicide or homicide. We still don't really know the answer to that. Roger was an unusual man. He claimed to be descended from French royalty, which was probably a false claim. He also, which was true, grew up in Poland under the Nazi occupation and later under the communist takeover. He wound up immigrating to the United States and made a fortune for himself here in the area just south of Richmond in particular. He was a research scientist for the Philip Morris Company, which is another major landmark south of Virginia. If you've ever driven along I-95, you've seen the Philip Morris facility. Roger actually, in his research, he did a variety of things. He had a number of patents that he won during his scientific career, including a major one for Philip Morris involving the treatment of tobacco to make it easier to roll into cigarettes that wound up being worth millions of dollars, although not to Roger. He didn't really make a lot of money off of his work for Philip Morris. He generally made, though, a lot of money during his time on this world, first by real estate speculation in Virginia, in this Richmond area, and also in art speculation, especially with regard to African art. He was often accused of shady dealings, of selling, for example, art that was not legitimate art, that was replicas. We don't really know the full story there, other than we know that he was under investigation for potentially fraudulent activities related to his art collection in 1992. Roger was an unusual man in many, many ways. He had a very poor relationship with his children. He felt that he was a part of the aristocracy of Poland, and therefore that in coming to the United States, he wanted to be a part of the aristocracy of Virginia. And Virginia, in a way, actually does have a kind of aristocracy itself, those who are associated with the power centers of Richmond and old money in Virginia. Definitely there is a kind of aristocracy there. Roger, in fact, bought into that aristocracy by buying the Windsor Horse Farm. And that horse farm was important in Virginia history, just like Drury's Bluff here, in actually being owned during the war, Civil War, by Robert E. Lee's older brother. And in fact, Lee, after he signed the surrender at Appomattox, camped on his older brother's farm before going into Richmond the next day. And so Roger literally bought into Virginia history, into that little piece of Virginia history that he felt his kids really didn't take seriously in their own lives. Like, what were they going to become? His two daughters, one had nothing to do with him, the other had what was a fairly strained relationship with her father. Roger also was quite a notorious philanderer. He divorced his wife roughly around 1980. He had had many affairs while married, and he continued to have relationships with multiple women at the same time, all the way up to the time of his death, right up to the week of his death. At the time of his death, he was at least involved with 3 women, including Beverly Monroe, with whom he'd had a relationship for roughly a dozen years. He also had a relationship with a woman who he had gotten pregnant with the intent of getting a male heir. That was one of the things he was disappointed with. He never had a male heir, and an heir who would be worthy of the name of Roger de la Bird. He was involved with several women other than his wife. He wound up getting divorced around 1980 from her after having multiple affairs, including with Beverly Monroe, the woman who is at the heart of our story today. She became involved with Roger. Roger divorced his wife. Beverly never married Roger, and in fact never had an exclusive relationship with him. He wound up being quite the womanizer throughout his life. He styled himself, again, part of a European tradition that he said was associated with not being that serious about the difference between commitment and romance, and so he felt he could just basically take advantage of women as he saw fit, and as a result he wound up very much alienating not only a number of women, but many of their husbands as well. Beverly stuck with him, though, through thick and thin during those years, and wound up being a major beneficiary of his will, which made her a suspect when Roger showed up dead on March 5th of 1992. So in early 1992, Roger had made a lot of enemies, actually, in his quest to become a part of Virginia aristocracy. There were people who perceived that they had been defrauded by him as part of his art dealings. There was the Philip Morris Company, who had a patent dispute. There were all these women who many of whom had husbands who had had affairs and were competing for attention with each other and for potentially a part of his estate. There were even members of his family who had a bad relationship with him. So on the night of March 4th, 1992, Beverly Monroe actually spent the evening with Roger. They started watching a National Geographic documentary. They each napped on a sofa. He had a couple of sofas in his living room for a little bit. She wound up going home sometime like 9:30, and left him on the other sofa. And she actually has some alibis at that point. She was seen by her son, who was up studying for a test the next day. He did not look at the clock, so he didn't know exactly when it was, but he believed it was around 10 o'clock that evening that she arrived home. She also went back out to the store to buy a few ordinary items. She had a receipt that she retained for some purchases around 10:20 that evening. And she actually had a witness who said that he saw her there and that he gave her his business card. So that she had a pretty solid set of alibis for the period between 10 and 11 o'clock, which was around the time when Roger died. She also tried to call him several times and got a busy signal each time when she called the house that night, and became worried, she said, about Roger. So the next morning, before going into work, she actually worked at Philip Morris as well. She drove by Windsor to check on Roger. Now, she didn't have a key to the house, which was unusual for a woman who had been in a serious relationship with Roger for a dozen years, basically. But the story was that Roger, at least in terms of how it was understood, Roger did not want her to walk in on him with another woman because he was a known womanizer. Beverly knew that he was, and so she respected the idea that she wasn't going to get a key because she didn't want to see anything she didn't want to see. And so she wasn't able to get into the house that morning of March 5th. There was another man who was kind of a tenant farmer on the property who she met there, and together they wound up finding a way into the house through a sliding door. And they found Roger's body. He obviously was dead from a gunshot wound through the temple. He was actually still on the sofa. Whether he had ever gotten up after Beverly left or not, we do not know. But he was laying basically in the fetal position with his hand up. There was a gun right beside him on the sofa. He had bled profusely from the wound, and it looked like he had committed suicide. They called the local county sheriff. They sent somebody out by the name of Neal, Deputy Sheriff Neal, and that individual then conducted a crime scene investigation. And this is where it gets interesting from our perspective in looking at forensic science, because Neal made a classic mistake, what we call base rate bias. And in base rate bias, basically the problem is that suicide is, depending upon the type of person and victim and that kind of thing, is 5 to 10 times more likely than homicide. And Neal started his investigation and basically did the entire crime scene work under the assumption that it was a suicide. And as a result, there was a lot of evidence that was never properly collected. The sofa where Roger died, which was soaked in blood, was not collected. There was blood underneath the sofa as well. There was so much that had come from the body that the rug underneath was soaked. In fact, the sofa disturbed the family, and so they removed it to a barn on the property of Windsor, and one of the men who helped to move it actually slipped a little bit in the blood. There was so much blood there on the underneath the sofa. There were 2 cigarettes that had been smoked at the time as well. Those were not collected. Neal did take a picture of the cigarettes, so he must have known that they were significant in some way, but he didn't collect them. This was before routine DNA analysis. If those cigarettes had been preserved, we probably could do DNA analysis today to see who it was that had smoked those cigarettes. And there was a fire in the fireplace, and it appeared that there were documents that had been burnt in the fireplace. Again, none of that was collected either, and so it was a very poorly preserved scene. One of the things that was really interesting is that between the 4th and 5th fingers, there was a gray spot found on his right hand. And the assumption at the time and subsequently was that that was gunshot residue, that he had been shot through the opening between his 4th and 5th finger, because that's where this gray mark was found on his hand, which is going to be very interesting to us and really caused an awful lot of other problems in the scene in the investigation as well. Beverly, of course, as well as the family of Roger, was devastated by this. The local county sheriff's department felt that they were kind of in over their head. Eventually, Dave Riley from the Virginia State Police pretty much took over the investigation and became suspicious of Beverly Monroe because of many issues. First, the fact that she said she was with Roger that night, but also because of this soot mark. The idea being that if he had his hand up against his head like this, how would he have taken his left hand and shot himself? He was actually shot by a fairly large caliber gun through his temple, going up here. The bullet went in. It did not exit the other side of the skull. It was actually recovered at autopsy. So how in the world would Roger have done this, and why? It was already unusual enough for a suicide to be of this sort, where he theoretically had shot himself through the temple. That's a very unusual suicide. It's kind of consistent with Roger because it's kind of an old-timey way to do it, but it isn't consistent in the sense that it was very odd for him to have reached around with his left hand and shot himself through his right hand. So Riley believed that it was a homicide, and so because Beverly Monroe, he knew Beverly Monroe was at least there that evening, he believed that she was the murderer and that she was covering over for it. He wound up using a variety of techniques to try to get her to confess. The primary approach being the one that he had been trained to, which was the Reed interrogation method. The Reed method is really an interesting thing. It's been used for well over half a century by police, and it's very effective if you're trying to interrogate a sociopath. Because what Reed does is it kind of gets into the head of the suspect, the idea that the investigator is sympathetic, and usually introducing what is called a theme or idea as part of the interrogation that either justifies or downplays the significance of the crime. And so there are many ways that Riley could have approached Beverly Monroe in this way. He could have just said, well, Roger was this, womanizer, and he didn't treat Beverly very well. She was kind of justified in killing him, right? He could have used that tack. He just chose not to. He felt like Beverly Monroe was somebody, she herself was well educated. She worked, as I said, in the patent office of Philip Morris. That's how she had met Roger. She was not going to be admitting to murder in that regard. So instead, he said, he convinced her that she was there, but that she had somehow blocked out the memory of being there, and that she therefore needed to confess to that. And that's what she did here after a bunch of things in terms of polygraph tests and things like that. But eventually they met here, and she signed a confession that was written out by Dave Riley to the effect that she was there at the time of Roger's death. What Beverly didn't know was Dave Riley's belief that Roger had been murdered, and that the forensic science proved that Roger had been murdered. And in fact, what Dave Riley had done was, to some extent, entrap her, because by admitting that she was there, in concert with the forensic evidence, that meant that she could be brought to trial for homicide, because whoever was there with him at the time that he was killed must have been the murderer. So she admitted that she was there. She said that she was just sleeping on the couch and was woken up by the gunshot and then left in a fright, and then blocked out the memory. But from Dave Riley's perspective, that was the same as a confession to murder. And he was relying on this smudge mark. He was relying on this idea that there was no reconstruction they could really come up with where, Roger could have killed himself with his left hand, and they were relying on the rest of the autopsy evidence. The autopsy had actually been overseen by Marcella Fierro, who was quite famous in her own right. She was the model, and I guess still remains the model, for the Kay Scarpetta novels. And she actually wound up testifying at Beverly Monroe's trial to the effect that I just outlined. This idea that although it didn't prove which they believed was gunshot residue, and the geometry of the wound, they couldn't prove that it was homicide, but it would be a very unusual circumstance if it were suicide. Unfortunately, at autopsy, and especially with the techniques of the day for gunshot residue, what that claim was really couldn't be supported. And I'll tell you why. So one thing Neil had done properly with Roger's body was he covered the hands with paper bags to preserve any kind of gunshot residue that was on the hands. This was standard operating procedure. At the time, it was correct procedure by Neil. They took the bags off at autopsy, and they did what is called a Palmer and Webb sampling of the hands. And by Palmer, what they mean is they took a sample of this part of the hand, and by Webb, they mean they took a sample of this part of the hand, basically around the forefinger and the thumb. And it was a complete wipe. So it was a wipe. So they were collecting everything that was on that part of the hand, from the left hand and from the right hand. So they never actually sampled the part of the right hand where that gray mark was. They just assumed from the photographs that it was gunshot residue. Those 4 wipes went off to the chemistry laboratory. And at the time, they didn't really have the techniques that we do today for looking at gunshot residue. Today, they would use what is called scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive spectroscopy. And what that means is they would be able to look at the little pieces of gunshot residue, the particles of gunshot residue, under a microscope, see what the morphology is, and also determine what the composition of the individual particle was. Usually the gunshot residue will have lead, and antimony and bismuth, or at least some combination of at least a couple of those in those particles, and that gives you a much more definitive idea of what is and isn't gunshot residue, and also allows you to determine kind of the distribution of the gunshot residue on a surface. They didn't have that, so what they did was something called atomic absorption spectroscopy on the materials that have been collected on these cloths from the different parts of the hand. And what they found is that the right hand did show some gunshot residue on the palmar surface, and then the rest of it had what they called in the report background gunshot residue, which was not a very helpful thing to say, because it wasn't clear to anyone what background meant in this case. It could mean the background you'd expect when somebody's exposed to a gunshot. There's going to be gunshot residue to some extent sprayed all over the place, and so there'll be some background gunshot residue for anybody who is anywhere nearby, including, of course, almost anywhere on the victim. It could mean background in the sense that it was right at the background of detectability in the atomic absorption spectroscopy as well. So maybe just you really weren't seeing it, but there were indications that maybe there were some lines for lead or whatever it would be in the chemical spectrum. Who even knows what background GSR meant in that report? And nobody really understood the import of what the sampling meant, or rather what it really didn't mean, frankly, because the end result of the poor collection strategy and the poor technology that was available at the time was that nobody knew whether there was any gunshot residue indicative of homicide or suicide with Roger. They really didn't know. And in particular, because of the cigarettes and the fireplace, it could easily be that he just smudged his hand with ash from a cigarette or from the fireplace. And there's no chemical analysis to back up anything. So he may have been shot through his right hand, but he may not. That might have just been complete coincidence that there was a little gray smudge on his hand in between his fourth and fifth fingers. That was never understood at time of trial. And honestly, it doesn't appear that Dave Riley or anybody else on the investigating team or the prosecution team truly understood the report enough for them to reconsider their hypothesis about Beverly having murdered Roger. They had what is often called choice supportive bias. And this is a common thing, when you have choice supportive bias, the classic case of it is a researcher tells you that a sequence starts 2, 4, 6. So they're not asking you what the next number is, they're asking you what's the rule. And most people say, well, it's the rule of increasing even numbers. And when people are told, no, that's not the rule we're talking about, they really have a hard time even coming up with an alternative rule associated with 2, 4, 6. And so, but there are many other things it could be. It could be increasing integers, or just increasing positive numbers, or anything of any variety of other kinds of ideas could be associated with that particular sequence. And this is a big problem in law enforcement investigation, because once you have the original hypothesis, like Dave Riley did, it's very hard to consider alternative ideas. And so what he was being faced with was a set of both forensic information and other information about the case that really pointed to several different possibilities, but he was bought into the one associated with Beverly Monroe having killed Roger De La Bird. And he and even the defense team for Beverly really had this blind tunnel vision, not seeing that both the crime scene work, the gunshot residue work, the reconstruction work from the body suggested that the homicide theory was probably wrong. And nonetheless, it went to trial on the basis of her confession here at Drury Bluff, and on the basis of the forensic science. She wound up being convicted, eventually going to prison. She wound up having a successful habeas corpus appeal on the basis that there was some key evidence that was not disclosed to her, including, for example, a jailhouse informant who said that she had sold, or that Beverly Monroe had approached her to buy an unmarked weapon a year before Roger's death. That turned out to be a false claim. That was a part of the testimony in the trial, and the evidence that was a false claim, and that the jailhouse informant had gotten preferential treatment on some unrelated charges was never shared with Beverly, along with a variety of other information. And so her conviction was eventually overturned, and I wouldn't say that she was fully exonerated, because one of the problems is that original base rate bias problem made it so that in this case, there's not enough information first to convict Beverly Monroe, really, to say definitively that she killed Roger, but there's also not enough evidence to completely exonerate her either. Like I said, we don't have the access to those cigarettes and to the other key evidence in the case, and we never will. So a lot of the mystery surrounding Roger De La Bird's death has never been solved. In some respects, Roger got his wish. What he wanted more than anything else is to be a part of Virginia history and a part of what is important to the Virginia aristocracy. His death wound up being the subject of a lot of media attention at the time, and he is a part of Virginia history. We just don't know everything. His death remains shrouded in mystery. It is an important thing, and the reason why I like to talk about it is that it was really important in forensic science. So it shows the importance of good crime scene investigation. It shows the importance of being able to consider multiple theories about what happened in a case like this, and being able to do critical thinking about the counter hypothesis as to whether somebody else may have. There are plenty of people around, girlfriends and husbands and all that kind of people, who might have been willing to kill Roger. And also the idea that technology has actually been our friend. If the more advanced form of gunshot residue analysis had been done, if better sampling had been done, if we had DNA analysis, this case might have turned out very, very differently. We'll never know, but it still remains a really, really interesting part of Virginia history and forensic science, and what we can learn from wrongful convictions.